All right. So we are on the Mount of Olives. We are looking at the most halakha piece of real estate in the entire world. Right? We are, in front of us lies the dome, the Temple Mount, right where the Jewish temple stood. Today, this is where the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock Islamic buildings are located. According to Jewish tradition, right underneath the Dome of the Rock, the reason why it's called the Rock, right, is there is a mountain. Anyone know the name of that mountain? Exactly, Moriah, right? According to Jewish tradition, when God created the world, right, in Genesis, he begins with Moriah and then spreads out. Also, Abraham, when he was told by God for his final test to sacrifice his only son, whom he loves, Isaac, right? He leaves Beersheba, goes on a 3-day journey, and arrives at Mount Moriah, and there he will bind Isaac, right? And by the way, with a nice, interesting thing about that story, right? With the binding of Isaac, a lot of people tend to think of Isaac, right, as this helpless young lad who's just sort of along for the ride, and there's nothing he could do about it. That's really not the case, because he is a 27-year-old man. He can overpower his over 100-year-old father. If he didn't want to be a sacrifice, he could have gotten out of it. He was a willing participant in this sacrifice, right? But of course, he's not sacrificed, right? And about to sacrifice him at the last minute, the angel Gabriel comes down and says, "Stay your hand, don't harm the boy." Instead, sacrifice this ram caught in the bushes. Because that's where that takes place, that David decides, right, when he conquers Jerusalem from the Jebusites, that it's improper, right, for the Lord to dwell in a tent. Because David is living in a nice palace, and why should he live in a palace and God live in a tent? That's something wrong about that. And he wants to build a house for the Lord. And God tells him, well, you know what, I really don't need one. I'm perfectly fine with the tent. David was very insistent. It's like, okay, fine. You want to build me a temple, a house? Okay, but not you, David. You can't do it because you are a man of war. Your son Shlomo, right, whose root word is shalem or shalom, is a man of peace. So David builds the infrastructure, and Solomon builds his temple on top of the mountain. So we can see here the temple built on top of the mountain, and in the very back room, right, was the Holy of Holies, right, the holiest place in all of Judaism, where in the first temple period, the Ark of the Covenant stood. Right, and over the Ark, right, was the Shekhinah. In Hebrew, it's called the Shekhinah, the divine presence of God, with like a sort of like a mystical cloud hovering over the Ark and also over the temple, right? And this divine essence hovering over the Ark, right, stood until the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BC, right? And begins the first exile. After 50 years, the Jews are allowed to come back when Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire defeated the Babylonians and allows the Jews to return. Right? After 20 years, they are finished and they rededicate and rebuild the temple. Right? And they build a temple to serve purposes for sacrifice, but it's, it's nothing to write home about. It's not, it's not the beautiful temple that Solomon had built. They didn't have the infrastructure, the money, right? These are basically refugees who are returning home, rebuilding the city.